It is shortly after midnight on the 6th of June, 1944, and somewhere in the darkness of the Norman countryside, a British paratrooper is moving through a hedgerow. He has landed at least half a mile from his intended drop zone. His platoon is scattered. He can hear movement in the darkness ahead. Boots on grass, the soft metallic click of equipment. But he cannot see who is there. He is perhaps 30 feet from whoever is making that noise. He might be 30 feet from a British soldier who is equally lost, equally frightened, equally grateful for the company. He might be 30 feet from a German sentry. He has one option. He opens his mouth and says a single word into the dark. Fish. He waits. The movement stops. A pause of perhaps 2 seconds, which is an extremely long time when you are crouching in a Norman hedgerow at 1 a.m. with a rifle in your hands and no idea what is on the other side of the darkness. Then a voice comes back. One word. Chips. And that is enough. That is everything. That single exchange. 2 words pulled from the deep cultural memory of a nation's working class dinner tables, chip shops, and Friday evenings, has just established beyond any reasonable doubt that the man in the darkness is British, not German, not a sentry, a friend. This is the story of how a takeaway meal that had been feeding the British working class for 80 years, that Winston Churchill personally refused to ration because he understood what it meant to ordinary people, that 35,000 shops across Britain were still serving wrapped in yesterday's newspaper, right through the darkest years of the war, became one of the most quietly brilliant identification systems of the entire Second World War. To understand how fish and chips ended up on the beaches of Normandy, you first have to understand what the British Army was actually facing in the summer of 1944. The problem of distinguishing friend from foe in the chaos of a night operation was not new, but Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of German-occupied France, made it more acute than at any previous point in the war. The airborne component of D-Day was unprecedented in scale. The British 6th Airborne Division and the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions together put more than 24,000 men into the Norman night in the hours before the beach landings began. They were dropped from aircraft in conditions of imperfect visibility, in winds that scattered paratroopers across an area far wider than planned. Drop zones that had been carefully selected and rehearsed were missed by miles in many cases. The result in those first confused hours was thousands of small groups of men, sometimes pairs, sometimes individuals, moving through unfamiliar French countryside in total darkness, trying to find their units, trying to orientate themselves, and desperately trying to avoid being shot by the Germans who were increasingly aware that something significant was happening. The standard approach to this problem was the challenge and countersign, a pre-agreed pair of words or phrases that would be exchanged to confirm identity. The challenge and countersign system had been used by military forces for centuries, and it worked well enough when soldiers were organised in coherent units with clear communication. It worked considerably less well when men were scattered across 50 square miles of dark countryside, and there was no guarantee that a soldier encountered had received the same briefing as the one challenging him. The Americans solved this problem for their airborne forces with a mechanical clicker device, a children's toy pressed into military service that produced a distinctive metallic click when operated. 1 click was the challenge, 2 clicks the response. It was effective, and its use is well documented. But the British Parachute Regiment took a different approach, and it was an approach that said something very particular about who the British were, what they valued, and what they ate on a Friday evening. The words they chose were not random, not bureaucratically assigned, not generated by a security committee. They were the 2 most British words that anyone in that organisation could think of. The 2 words that, spoken together, named a meal that virtually every man in the British Armed Forces had grown up eating. The 2 words that, crucially, no German soldier, however well trained, however good his English, however thorough his preparation, would produce naturally, instinctively, and without hesitation when challenged in the darkness. Fish and chips. The genius of the fish and chips code. And it deserves to be called genius, even though its simplicity makes it look like the opposite of genius. Lay in what linguists would later call deep cultural encoding. A code is only as secure as it is difficult to replicate. The challenge and countersign system failed when the enemy knew the words. the fish and chip system was theoretically equally vulnerable. If a German intelligence officer had managed to discover that the British paratroopers were using these two words, he could presumably have briefed his own soldiers accordingly. But that was only half of the story, and the less important half. The other half was how the words were said. Fish and chips was not merely a phrase in British English, it was a cultural performance. The way a British working-class man said chips in 1944. The specific vowel sounds, the rhythm, the casual confidence of a man for whom this word was attached to 1,000 specific sensory memories of warm newspaper and malt vinegar, and the walk home on a dark winter evening, was not a thing that could be learned from a phrase book or rehearsed in a Hamburg safe house. It was embodied knowledge. It lived in the body the way that language learned in childhood lives in the body, below the level of conscious thought. The Ministry of Food understood something similar when it made the decision, sustained throughout the war, never to ration fish and chips. This was not a trivial decision. By 1940, Britain's food supply was under severe pressure. The German U-boat campaign in the North Atlantic was throttling the merchant convoys that brought the country a significant proportion of its calories. Rationing had been introduced for butter, bacon, sugar, meat, tea, cheese, eggs, jam, and clothing. The Ministry of Food had the authority and the bureaucratic machinery to ration virtually anything. It chose not to ration fish and chips. The reasoning was stated plainly by senior ministry officials and echoed by Churchill himself, who famously referred to fish and chips as the good companions of the British people. A pound of tea could be rationed to last a week. A joint of meat could be budgeted, stretched, made to serve multiple meals. But fish and chips was not merely food. It was, in a very real sense, the texture of ordinary British life. The queues outside Chippy's on a Friday evening. The warmth of the paper in cold hands. The smell that meant home, that meant ordinary, that meant the world was still recognisable despite everything the Germans were throwing at it. In 1944, at the height of the war, there were still approximately 35,000 fish and chip shops operating in Britain, serving an estimated 360 million portions per year. That works out at roughly 6 portions per person in the country. The men of the British Parachute Regiment had grown up in those queues. They had eaten those portions. The two words were not a code they had learned. They were a code they already knew, in a way that went deeper than learning. In the Norman countryside on the night of the 5th to the 6th of June, 1944, this cultural depth proved its operational value again and again in the hours before the beach landings began. Members of the 6th Airborne Division, scattered across an area from the Orne River to the Dives and beyond, used the exchange repeatedly to identify fellow British soldiers in conditions where any other form of identification was impossible. The darkness was near total. Radio communications were fragmentary. Unit cohesion in those first hours was an aspiration rather than a reality for many small groups of men. What is documented is that the exchange worked. The accounts of veterans from the 6th Airborne, collected by military historians in the decades after the war, include multiple references to the fish and chips challenge, not as a formal system described in orders, but as something that simply happened, organically, because it was the obvious thing to do. One veteran, interviewed in the 1980s, recalled that when he first challenged a figure in the darkness and received the correct response, his immediate thought was not relief at having identified a friend, but the involuntary mental image of a specific chip shop in Sheffield, where he had eaten regularly before the war. The code had worked precisely because it activated exactly that kind of memory. German soldiers in the area were, by all accounts, completely unable to replicate the exchange convincingly. Several documented incidents exist in which German soldiers or officers, aware that some kind of British exchange involving food words was being used, attempted to respond but produced the words with the wrong rhythm, the wrong emphasis, or an accent that gave them away immediately. The very Britishness of the words, their deep embeddedness in a specific cultural and class experience that no amount of language training could fully replicate, made them better than any randomly assigned countersign would have been. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Comparing the British approach with what German military intelligence attempted in the same period reveals, as so often in this war, a fundamental difference in institutional thinking. German intelligence under the SD and the Abwehr, invested enormous resources in language training for agents and in the production of convincing documents and cover identities. The training was thorough, systematic, and in many respects impressive. What it consistently failed to produce was agents who could pass the kind of informal cultural test that fish and chips represented. The American use of the clicker device for the airborne operation was effective in its own domain, a purely mechanical signal that required no cultural knowledge, but it had a significant limitation that the fish and chips code did not. A clicker could be captured. A German soldier who acquired a clicker could, in principle, use it to deceive an American challenger. The fish and chips exchange could not be captured in the same way. Knowing the words was necessary but not sufficient. You also had to say them right. The Canadian forces in Normandy used a similar approach to the British, with Canadian-specific cultural references forming the basis of informal identification challenges in the confused hours after landing. Australian forces elsewhere in the Pacific Theatre had developed analogous systems using distinctively Australian slang and references that served the same function. In each case, the underlying principle was the same. The deepest security lies not in codes that are kept secret, but in cultural knowledge that cannot be faked. The Germans attempted something similar in the opposite direction during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when Operation Greif sent English-speaking German soldiers behind Allied lines in American uniforms. Some of these agents were caught not by any formal security measure, but by their failure to produce the right informal cultural responses when challenged by American soldiers. The correct way to hold a cigarette, the right answer to a question about a baseball team, the instinctive response to a casual Americanism. Cultural fingerprints, in other words, of exactly the same kind that fish and chips represented for the British. The legacy of the fish and chips code extends in two directions that are worth considering separately. The first is the immediate military legacy, the principle that cultural knowledge makes a more robust identification system than any randomly assigned code or mechanical device was observed, documented, and incorporated into British military thinking in the post-war period. Later developments in Special Forces doctrine, including the training given to SAS and SBS personnel in deep cultural immersion before deployment, owe something, at several removes, to the insight that fish and chips represented. The second legacy is harder to quantify and perhaps more important. The fish and chips code worked because of a decision taken years earlier, sustained through years of hardship, to protect something that might easily have been sacrificed to more immediately obvious priorities. The decision not to ration fish and chips was, in the most literal possible sense, a strategic decision. Churchill and the Ministry of Food understood that national morale was a military resource, and that national morale in Britain was partly maintained by the continued existence of the things that made ordinary British life feel like itself. The fish and chip shop was one of those things. The Imperial War Museum holds extensive materials relating to British home-front food policy during the Second World War, including Ministry of Food documents that discuss the rationing decisions in detail. The 6th Airborne Division's operational records at the National Archives include veteran accounts that reference the identification challenges used on the night of the 5th to the 6th of June, 1944. The chair in which Joseph Jacobs was executed is on display in the White Tower, but the paper in which fish and chips were wrapped is somewhat harder to find in an archive. Return for a moment to that hedgerow. It is shortly after midnight on June 6, 1944. A man crouches in the dark with a rifle in his hands, listening to movement he cannot identify. He says one word. He waits 2 seconds that feel much longer. And from the darkness comes the reply that tells him everything he needs to know. Not a code that was assigned to him in a briefing. Not a mechanical device pressed into his palm before he boarded the aircraft. Not a randomly generated countersign that he had memorized from a slip of paper that was supposed to be destroyed after use. The word that comes back to him is a word that he has known his entire life, a word that carries, in its single syllable, the warmth of a specific kind of paper, a specific kind of evening, a specific kind of smell that every man in that dark field knew from childhood and would know until the day he died. The word is chips. And with that word, a 20-year-old man from Sheffield or Bradford or Coventry or Glasgow knows that the man in the darkness is one of his own. Knows it in his bones. Not because the word is secret. Not because the enemy couldn't theoretically have found it out. but because the word means something that the enemy cannot mean when they say it. Because the word carries a weight of lived experience that no amount of training can replicate. Because you either grew up eating fish and chips on a Friday evening in Britain, or you didn't, and the difference is audible. The Germans had built the most sophisticated military machine in European history. They had developed radar, jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, advanced submarine technology. Their intelligence services were professional, ruthless, and in many respects effective. They had spent years training agents to pass as British citizens. None of it mattered in the dark of a Norman hedgerow, when the question was whether a man's vowels carried the memory of a chip shop in Sheffield. Britain did not win the Second World War with fish and chips, let that be absolutely clear. But Britain fought it, in part, by understanding something that the Germans consistently underestimated, that a nation is made of 10,000 ordinary things, and that those ordinary things, sustained and protected through years of hardship, carry a weight that no intelligence service has ever been able to fully replicate. Not a cipher, not a weapon, not a military doctrine, a chip shop, and the word that everyone knew.